Hello students, in today's class we are going to focus on foodborne infections. Although food is a very important part of our daily lives because it's a source of nutrition, we need to take many precautions in order to ensure that the food we eat is safe for consumption. If we do not follow these precautions, then food can become a source of illness. Today's class we are going to talk about the various microorganisms which cause foodborne infections and the precautions we need to take in order to prevent our food from becoming unsafe. Food can become contaminated through unclean utensils and equipment. Every day in the kitchen when cooking is going on, many precautions have to be taken in order to ensure that the food we eat is clean and safe for consumption. Even in commercial establishments, many a times we visit restaurants for a change or whenever we want to eat something new. It's important for commercial food establishments also to ensure food safety. They need to take precautions, like for example the food handlers have to be given some instructions on how to handle food in a safe manner so that food is safe to eat. Because if the utensils are not kept clean or if the water used for cooking is not clean, then the food can become contaminated with microorganisms and this can lead to foodborne illness. The microorganisms in the human body are eliminated by means of fecal matter and this goes into the sewage. Sometimes untreated sewage may find its way into drinking water systems and sometimes the seawater or the lakes can also become contaminated with sewage. Then the fish also get contaminated and our food also becomes contaminated with microorganisms. Salad vegetables are at a higher risk of contamination because these are eaten raw. Therefore, we need to be very careful when we make salads or when we eat salads. So, the water which you use to prepare salads, to wash the vegetables, etc. should be very clean. And hands also need to be washed thoroughly when you cut a salad because the vegetables are not subjected to heat treatment. The advantage of subjecting our food to heat treatment is that many of these microorganisms are heat labile and they are destroyed during cooking and heating. But when you eat a salad, since we are eating it raw, similarly when you eat a fruit, it's very important to wash it thoroughly and it's very important to ensure that the hands and the cutting boards, knives, etc. which are used to prepare a salad or fruit are very clean. Roots and tubers are also at a high risk for contamination because they come directly into contact with the soil. Therefore, they need to be washed thoroughly to ensure that there is no microbial contamination. So, what is foodborne illness? Now, the term foodborne illness is a general term which is used to describe any illness which may be caused when any organism, substance or material is present in food and this gains entrance into the human body when food is consumed. And after a few days, symptoms may be observed and this can lead to foodborne illness. What are the causes of contamination? How does our food become contaminated with microorganisms? This can occur by faulty handling. For example, if the hands are not clean, we have to ensure that our hands are clean. We need to wash our hands thoroughly after visiting the restroom or whenever we touch any raw food or any unclean surfaces. Secondly, food can become contaminated because of poor sanitary practices such as using unclean chopping boards, using unclean kitchen equipment or not washing foods thoroughly. Food can also become contaminated through insects, rodents or rats and microorganisms. Sometimes food may undergo natural decay, that is, natural decay in plant and animal tissues is accompanied by foul odor and changes in appearance and taste. Therefore, we need to ensure that the food which we are using for preparation is not decayed, it is wholesome and fresh and clean. If there is any spoilage because of natural decay, this becomes visible in terms of appearance and taste. When there is visible spoilage, it is important to reject the food. Food thus is a very important medium of microorganisms. Sometimes it can be a medium for microorganisms because food is a medium for growth and multiplication of microorganisms, especially Staphylococci and Salmonella. So if these kind of microorganisms multiply rapidly in food, then this can lead to food poisoning or food infection. What is food poisoning? Food poisoning is when some unpleasant or unwanted materials contaminate the food. So food poisoning is not only caused by microorganisms or microbial growth, it can also be caused by natural toxins in food. It can be caused by toxic metals such as cadmium and lead, which can lead to food poisoning. It can also be caused by chemical toxins. Additionally, food poisoning can be caused by insecticides or pesticides. Very often we hear of pesticides causing so much of damage, and if we continuously exposed to pesticides, it can be carcinogenic, it can lead to cancer. Therefore, the agriculturists and people who are involved in producing our food have to take precaution to see that the food does not contain pesticide residues. Similarly, insecticides, sometimes even at home when the items are kept in the larder, sometimes if there are cockroaches, you tend to use a spray or some kind of repellent. So it's important to ensure that no insecticide comes into contact with food. So the larder has to be emptied completely of the food, and only then the insecticide has to be used. Otherwise, it can be a foodborne hazard. So which are the microorganisms which cause foodborne illnesses? Several microorganisms in the environment can cause foodborne illness, like bacteria, viruses, parasites or nematodes, and protozoans. So among all these microorganisms, bacterial contamination is the most common cause of food poisoning in the industry. So when we consume foods which contain bacteria, it can produce some kind of symptoms because of changes in the stomach and intestine. What is the meaning of food poisoning? How is it different from food infection? Now, food poisoning is an illness which is caused by toxins present in contaminated food. These toxins may be accidentally or intentionally added. Higher temperatures can lead to toxins being present. So, these toxins can be present even at higher temperatures than the bacteria which produce them. They are also present in inadequately heated foods. So, higher temperatures do not necessarily destroy the toxins. They may destroy the bacteria which produce them, but the toxins are not destroyed. Whereas a food infection is an illness caused by microorganisms. It occurs when we consume food containing living bacteria which are capable of multiplying within the stomach and intestine. Now, normally in the stomach contains gastric juice which is acidic, and this can lead to some of the bacteria being destroyed. But if the microorganisms survive in the stomach and pass on to the intestine, they grow rapidly in the intestine because the pH is neutral, and then they irritate the lining of the intestines, resulting in diarrhea and abdominal pain. For any food poisoning or food infection to occur, the food sample must contain 1 million or more of bacteria which is present. Therefore, the bacterial load in a food sample has to be very high in order for food poisoning or infection to occur. Now moving on to the severity of the infection. What are the factors which affect the severity of the infection or foodborne illness or food poisoning? It depends mainly upon three factors, that is, the type of the organism causing the illness. Some organisms cause more severe illnesses than others. Secondly, it depends upon the susceptibility of the individual. The susceptibility will vary depending upon the age of the individual and also on the health status of the individual. For example, the very young people and the elderly and people who are convalescing from a disease are more susceptible to foodborne illness. It will also depend upon the number of bacteria or amount of toxin consumed. If the food contains a large number of bacteria and more amount of toxin, then more severe is the foodborne illness. Now moving on to the different types of organisms which cause foodborne illness. First, let's look at Staphylococci. Now, staphylococcal food poisoning is a very common kind of food poisoning. It is caused by the bacteria Staphylococcus aureus, which is a gram-positive cocci, and this is present in the environment, and it usually produces an enterotoxin which causes food poisoning. So, food usually becomes contaminated by infected food handlers. So, if a person, for example, the Staphylococci aureus is usually present in the nose and throat. So if a food handler touches his nose, or if he uses soiled handkerchiefs and does not, or touches the lesions on his skin and does not wash his hands thoroughly, then he can pass on the microorganisms if he is preparing food or handling food. So it's very important to wash hands thoroughly when a person has infection. Although it is preferable if a person has Staphylococci, then it's better that he does not handle the food. So once the organism passes on to food, it can be ingested, and once it is ingested in the intestine, the enterotoxin is produced from the organism, and this causes vomiting, diarrhea, etc. However, this can be prevented if the food is treated properly, and if the food is heated to very high temperatures, then the microorganisms are destroyed. So the foods which are usually affected by Staphylococcus are protein-rich foods like meat, fish, milk and poultry. So whenever these kind of foods are being prepared, it's important to ensure that hands are kept clean. It's important to ensure that the food handler is not suffering from any infection, and when the food is cooked, it should be heated to very high temperatures so that in case there is any microorganism, it is destroyed. Staphylococcus is also found in cooked foods which are eaten cold, like custards, trifles and cream puddings, because these are stored in the refrigerator, and if there is faulty food handling, then microorganisms can pass from hands onto these cold foods, and in cold temperatures these microorganisms thrive. Staphylococcus is also found in foods which is exposed to lukewarm temperature for a few hours. Therefore, it's very important to ensure that there should not be too much of time gap between preparation of food and consumption, because if there's a long period and the food is exposed to warm environment, then these microorganisms can grow. Now moving on to another very common microorganism called E. coli. E. coli or Escherichia coli is a very common kind of food poisoning. It is regarded to be a part of the normal flora of the intestinal tract of humans and animals. So these organisms, they cause food poisoning outbreaks, and the organisms of E. coli which are involved in human diarrheal diseases or food poisoning outbreaks are designated as enteropathogenic E. coli. So the diarrheal diseases which are caused by these organisms, they are classified into two groups, Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 is caused by the enterotoxin released from the E. coli, which produces a cholera-like enterotoxigenic illness. These enterotoxins produce two types of toxins, a heat-stable and a heat-labile toxin. The heat-stable one causes infantile diarrhea, and the heat-labile toxin causes traveler's diarrhea. The second group, it is produced by an invasive strain which produces a cytotoxin which causes an invasive illness, colitis and dysentery-like syndrome. These serotypes are non-enterotoxigenic, and they grow in the colon and penetrate or invade the colonic mucosa, causing abdominal cramps and watery diarrhea. For either the invasive or enterotoxigenic illness to occur, the person has to consume a large infective dose of enteropathogenic E. coli. Therefore, the food has to be highly contaminated or inadequately stored or refrigerated to allow for prolific growth. E. coli grows, the optimal temperature for E. coli to grow is 37 degrees centigrade, which is about room temperature. However, these organisms are heat sensitive or heat labile. Therefore, they are destroyed when milk is pasteurized or when food is properly cooked. So if we ensure that our food is properly cooked, then the food can be safe and there is no need for these kind of organisms to thrive. However, care should be taken while consuming salads, fruits or foods which are not subjected to heat treatment like juices, etc. Because if the hands are not clean, especially after using the restroom, then the organisms can pass on from the hands to the food. Therefore, to ensure that, the hands should be washed very thoroughly. Now moving on to another kind of organism, that is Campylobacter. Campylobacter, that is C. jejuni and C. coli, are heat tolerant and they are associated with acute gastroenteritis in humans. They are destroyed only at temperatures of 45 to 50 degrees centigrade. The foods which are subject to attack by Campylobacter are raw milk, undercooked chicken, pasteurized contaminated milk, barbecued chicken and raw hamburgers. And the signs and symptoms of Campylobacter infection are usually diarrhea, abdominal pain, sometimes fever, headache, etc. The incubation period may be 2 to 3 days. but sometimes it may be as high as 7 to 10 days. What is the meaning of incubation period? Incubation period is a time gap from the time the organism enters the human body till the first symptoms appear. For example, let us say that you visited a roadside food vendor and had pani puri. Let's say you had pani puri on Monday, and after that you forgot about it. Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe on Thursday you suddenly got diarrhea. So the time gap between Monday to Thursday, when the Monday is the day when you had these unclean food, that's pani puri, so the organisms must have entered into the intestinal tract, but the symptoms were seen only on Thursday. So the time between Monday and Thursday is known as incubation period. So for Campylobacter, the incubation period is 2 to 3 days, but it may be as high as 7 to 10 days. Therefore, in order to ensure that the food is not contaminated with Campylobacter, it's important to take precautions like pasteurization of milk and proper cooking of foods, especially animal foods. Campylobacter is very common in animal foods like chicken, fish, poultry, pork, etc. So, for example, if there's a chicken sandwich and it's allowed to stay outside in warm temperature for a very long time, these kind of organisms can grow. Therefore, in order to prevent such things from happening, the food should be properly cooked and it should be consumed as soon as possible after preparation. Now moving on to another uncommon kind of food poisoning called botulism. Botulism is a very rare and uncommon kind of food poisoning. It is caused by an organism called Clostridium botulinum, which is a spore forming anaerobic bacteria. Clostridium botulinum is very uncommon. It's usually found in the soil. Once these organisms find their way into the human body, in the intestine they produce a toxin which affects the nervous system, and it's very dangerous. 2/3 of people who are affected by this organism usually die, so it can be fatal also. Clostridium botulinum is usually found in the soil, so it usually contaminates vegetables, and sometimes it also affects canned food. So if food is not properly canned and if the proper precautions are not taken, then canned foods can become infected with Clostridium botulinum. So the foods which are commonly infected are canned foods like canned tomatoes, canned fruits like peaches, pears, acidic foods, etc. So care should be taken that the cans are sterilized and heated to very high temperatures so that they are not contaminated with Clostridium botulinum. Sometimes a canned food may get infected with other microorganisms. These microorganisms can then cause Clostridium botulinum to grow because of a rise in pH. Now moving on to other microorganisms, mainly the Bacillus cereus. Now Bacillus cereus is a spore forming aerobic rod shaped toxic foodborne illness, and this is caused when we consume a food which contains Bacillus cereus. Now this organism is present in soil, in dust, in water. It's also present on cereal grains. It's a very common kind of food poisoning, and it's usually seen when we consume cooked rice which is eaten the next day. So if rice is cooked and kept in the refrigerator, it's important to reheat it thoroughly before consumption to ensure that it is not containing Bacillus cereus. It's better to again pressure cook the rice and then consume it. Clostridium perfringens is a spore forming anaerobe, and this is usually found in human and animal intestinal tracts. It's also found in soil, in dust, and contaminated meat and poultry. So this organism, it's a rod shaped organism and it usually multiplies in food. So consuming food which contains Clostridium perfringens will lead to this kind of foodborne illness. This organism is not destroyed in normal cooking temperatures, and it usually thrives in cooked meat. So if cooked meat is not properly stored, if it is stored in warm temperatures for a very long time, then it can become infected with Clostridium perfringens. Therefore, animal foods like meat, sausages, pork, chicken, poultry, etc., they should be consumed as quickly as possible after being cooked, or they should be refrigerated immediately and then reheated to very high temperatures before consuming. Clostridium perfringens releases a toxin in the intestine which causes symptoms like, for example, bloody diarrhea. It is usually seen in meat, also in food joints. which allow anaerobic conditions to occur. Therefore, what should we do to keep food safe from bacteria? First and foremost, we should cool food rapidly so that microorganisms do not multiply. And it's very important to handle raw and cooked food separately to prevent cross contamination. For example, in the freezer, you might be storing raw chicken. At the same time, you might be storing ice cream and chocolate. It's very important to ensure that the chicken is completely wrapped and stored in a proper container away from the chocolate and ice cream, so preferably on different shelves, and everything should be completely packaged, because otherwise the raw chicken or poultry contains microorganisms which can pass on to the ice cream and which you are going to eat raw without subjecting to heat treatment. So therefore, cross contamination should be prevented. Similarly, in the lower part of the refrigerator, if you are storing a cooked food item like cutlets, and if you are going to also keep some other raw vegetables, if the raw vegetables come into contact with the cutlets, then the microorganisms can spread from the raw food to the cooked food. Therefore, raw food and cooked food should be kept separately, and care should be taken to see that both do not come into contact with each other. Kitchen and personal hygiene should also be maintained. In the kitchen, all cutting boards, knives, and all equipment used for food preparation like mixers, food processors should be cleaned regularly, disinfected, and stored in a dry condition. Personal hygiene is also very important. Like for example, washing hands, the food handlers should be given some tips about how they should maintain food in a hygienic manner, like taking a bath every day, using a cap or apron, gloves, etc., washing hands, keeping the nails trim, etc. Fruits and vegetables should be washed thoroughly because they are going to be eaten raw, and since they are not subjected to heat treatment, organisms can thrive in these fruits and vegetables, and since they are eaten raw, it can lead to food poisoning or foodborne infection. Therefore, it's very important to keep food safe from bacteria. These are the 4 main rules. First, clean. Wash hands, surfaces, wash fruits and vegetables. Second, separate. Ensure that there is no cross contamination. Separate raw foods from cooked foods. Cook. Cook to a very high temperature so that all the microorganisms are destroyed. Then chill. If the food is not going to be eaten immediately, then store in a refrigerator so that microbial growth does not occur. Now moving on to another infection called Salmonella. Salmonella is also a very common kind of bacteria which mainly infects meat and eggs. So it's usually once Salmonella grows in food, then it contaminates food and drink. This organism grows in the intestine and it's eliminated in the feces. It produces a toxin which grows in the intestine and causes symptoms like diarrhea, etc. So to prevent food from getting contaminated with Salmonella, it's very important that food is cooked to very high temperatures. There are other infections like for example enteric fever, which is nothing but typhoid and paratyphoid. Typhoid is caused by Salmonella typhi and paratyphoid by S. enteritidis. So how is it spread? It's usually spread by water contaminated by sewage. Sewage is nothing but all the unclean waste material, that is fecal matter, passes into a water and into a system called sewage. And if our food gets contaminated by the water from sewage, then we can get typhoid or paratyphoid. Also, food contaminated by food handlers. If a food handler has typhoid or paratyphoid, and if he does not take precautions when handling the food, he can transmit the infection. Foods involved are usually raw milk, raw vegetables, and contaminated water. Bacilli dysentery and shigellosis is an intestinal infection which is caused by rod-shaped bacteria. It is spread by poor personal hygiene and faulty sewage disposal. So it's very important to ensure that hands are washed thoroughly after using the restroom. The foods involved are moist foods like macaroni salad, mutton cutlets, milk and potatoes. Cholera is caused by a comma-shaped microorganism called Vibrio cholerae, and it is usually spread through contaminated water. So water which is contaminated by feces from a person who has cholera spreads the infection. The foods involved are usually fish, shellfish growing in contaminated waters, and stale food. Therefore, in order to prevent infection, there are some precautions we need to take. What are these precautions? In order to maintain food safety and make sure that the food we consume is safe to eat, there are some tips which we need to follow. What are these? First of all, use pasteurized milk. Sometimes we do not know that what is pasteurization. Pasteurization is nothing but subjecting the milk to very high temperatures in order to destroy the microorganisms. If the milk is not pasteurized, then the microbial growth can occur. So, for example, some people go to a dairy and directly buy the milk which is available, which is extracted from the cow or buffalo. Such milk is not pasteurized and it can spread bovine TB. So, only if the milk is pasteurized, only then it should be consumed. Organisms can also be killed by heat treatment. Therefore, we should ensure that our food is cooked thoroughly. And to avoid microbial growth, rapid cooking, chilling and prompt refrigeration is important. Avoid leftover foods which are not heated well. If you are using leftover foods from the fridge, then they should be heated to very high temperatures so that the center of the food is also cooked and whatever bacterial growth is there, it is destroyed. Practice personal hygiene as well as kitchen hygiene. In the kitchen, both at home and in commercial establishments, disinfection should occur at least once a week, and all kitchen equipment, food processors, mixers, etc. should be cleaned every day. Cross-contamination from raw foods to cooked foods should be prevented. So, handle raw and cooked foods separately. Hands should be washed thoroughly after handling raw foods like, for example, raw meat. Fruits and vegetables should be washed thoroughly. Wash hands as often as you can. A person who is handling food should wash hands very often. Then we should control the growth of rodents, insects and dust. Rodents or rats can spread infection, so we need to control them. Equipment should be kept in a clean and hygienic manner, and they should be stored dry and not in a moist condition, because if the equipment is moist, then microbes can grow like the microorganisms. Thorough cooking of animal foods, meat, chicken, etc. should be pressure cooked to ensure destruction of bacteria. Wastes should be destroyed or disposed in a sanitary manner, and always clean water should be used to cook the food. We need to protect our water, and the water used for cooking should be very clean. It should be filtered, boiled, etc. Now moving on to control of foodborne illness. Foodborne illness can be spread by careless food handlers. So, food handlers who are already having disease or who are carriers of diseases can spread foodborne infections. So, they need to take precautions, like they need to follow the basic principles of hygiene, like for example, separating raw and cooked food so that cross contamination does not occur. Also, food handlers need to wash their hands very often. Foods should be reheated thoroughly so that the inner part of the food is also subjected to high temperatures to destroy microorganisms. Frozen foods should be thawed at temperatures between 10 to 15 degrees centigrade, and only thawed foods should be cooked. Cooked foods which are to be served hot should be stored at temperatures above 63 degrees centigrade. Avoid cooling and reheating food repeatedly because this can lead to microbial growth. Leftover foods should be refrigerated immediately and should not be exposed to the danger zone. Food should be prepared only in quantities which are required and for which there is adequate refrigeration space. Suspect food should be discarded immediately without tasting. Kitchen cooking equipment should be cleaned daily, and also regular pest control. Adequate toilet and wash basin facilities should be provided for food handlers with continuous supply of running water. High-risk foods such as meat, fish, poultry and milk should be purchased only from certified dealers. Thus, it's very important to understand that food safety is in your hands. So, today's lesson focused on foodborne illnesses, how they are caused by bacteria, they are caused by different types of organisms, and that what are the precautions we need to take in order to prevent food from becoming contaminated with microorganisms. We also discussed about the importance of educating the food handlers and the principles of hygiene which they need to follow in order to ensure that the food which is being prepared is safe for consumption. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson.